So, a very warm welcome to our first speaker this morning, Gerald Morgan. Gerald is a teacher and historian, was head teacher in secondary schools and a lecturer at Aberystwyth University. He's an author of 25 books and many articles in Welsh and English, mostly on the history of Wales and Ceredigion, and he lives in Aberystwyth. So, very warm welcome, Gerald, and we look forward to hearing about the stormy petrel of Welsh literature, Aneurin Talman Davies. So, very warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about the history of Aneurin Talman Davies. Thank you. Thank you. I had hardly a word of Welsh when I met Aneurin Talman Davies about 1959, but he was very kind towards me. Indeed, I persuaded him to be a guest speaker at the St David's Day event with the Brighton Cymrodorion, since my father was the chairman for that year. I well remember Aneurin standing in front of the hearth and pretending to boast, I suppose, at the stormy petrel of the Welsh literary scene. By then, he was a Welsh respected figure in Wales, but he seemed proud of that description. As a young man, he'd established a Welsh language magazine in England. He'd published books on James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, and in 1949, he'd moved from his Calvinistic Methodist roots to the church in Wales. It's very difficult today for a young person to understand the magnitude of such a step. Aneurin's roots lay in Ceredigion, but he was born at Trefalwynflindre, his mother's home, in 1909. His father, William Talman Davies, came from Ysbyty Ystwyth in Ceredigion. Other than Aneurin, there were three other sons, Gronwy, Elfyn, and Alun. Alun would cooperate closely with Aneurin for many years and funded more than one enterprise. The family moved to industrial Gosainon 2 years later, where his father served as a Methodist minister at Libanus Chapel, and he received his secondary education at Gowerton Grammar School. He didn't enjoy his time there and left at the age of 14 to become an apprentice pharmacist. This appears an odd choice, but the reason was that he was interested in photography at that time, and someone had told him that the best choice was to become a chemist, because it was to the chemist shop that people would go to have their photos developed. He had to delay a little, for in his youth, he developed TB and had to be bedbound for many months. And he took advantage of this time to read from his father's extensive library. William Talman was friendly with another minister in Swansea, Lodwig Lewis, the father of Saunders Lewis, who was at that time a lecturer in Welsh at Swansea University. The young Aneurin came to know Saunders, who gave him lessons in poetry and gave him a copy of his book about William's Pantycelyn, which was Aneurin's Bible. Irgobaith Cymru and its camps formed an important part of Aneurin's education. The camps would be a means for him to meet other young Welsh speakers from all parts of Wales. After recovering from his illness, he went to London in about 1932 to work as a pharmacy manager in Watford. Despite his busy life, he participated in the Welsh life of the capital, took part in debates about religion, was secretary of the London branch of Plaid Cymru. He was one of the party's most effective speakers. Welsh life in London at that time was lively because of the influx of people from Wales. Aneurin adored the bookshops of Charing Cross Road and it was in London that he formed a friendship with David Jenkins, a young London-born lawyer who was another enthusiastic Welshman. Jenkins had also been brought up a Methodist, but he'd already found his way to worship at the Welsh Church of St Bened's and the Church of All Saints, Margaret Street. Both friends were interested in the work of the Catholic Eric Gill and the ideas, the high church ideas of T.S. Eliot, and this ultimately led Aneurin, along with his friend the poet Gwener, to be received into the church in Wales, in Abergwili, in 1944. We'll return to this subject later on. Although Aneurin was a pharmacist who carried out his work conscientiously, his heart by now belonged to Welsh and English literature, and he'd been contributing articles to Tarian y Gweithiwr, the last of the South's Welsh language papers. He wrote experimental poetry in Welsh but couldn't find a publisher. The main Welsh literary periodical, Y Llenor, was in the hands of W.J. Griffith, and he had no truck with newfangled experimental methods. Two important events took place in 1936 in Aneurin's life. Firstly, he married Mary Evans, a beautiful Welsh woman from Barry, and the couple settled in Watford. It proved to be an extremely happy marriage. Secondly, Aneurin started work on his own magazine, Heddiw, jointly with David Jenkins. Aneurin had no money to go to a printer, so he found a small Adana press, which could only print one small page at a time, rather than the usual minimum of 4. But bursting with ambition, Aneurin approached the headquarters of the Monotype Corporation to buy type. When he was asked how much type he needed, he had to admit his situation, and he was given free enough type to complete the task. The lives of Aneurin, his brother Alan, and David Jenkins were filled every hour with the labour of setting one page at a time, printing it, reassembling the type, and starting again. The task would be wearisome enough. But when a sonnet by Gwenallt arrived, Aneurin knew that it had to be done. At last, the first edition of Heddiw was ready by the Wednesday of Eisteddfod week. Alan drove his little car all the way from Watford to Fishguard, and every one of the 400 copies was sold for 6p each. And so there was money available, therefore, to publish the second edition of Heddiw. Publishing the first issue was quite a feat, with all the work taking place in England. But that didn't last long, because by the following year, Aneurin had opened his own pharmaceutical business in 1937 in Swansea, and it quickly became a focus for the Welsh speakers in the town. Aneurin and Mary lived in Swansea, and the following year, the first baby, Owen Talbot, arrived, followed by his brother Geraint Talbot in 1943, and his sister Eleanor Talbot in 1946. And I'd like to thank the last two for their help in preparing this. As if Aneurin didn't have enough work, in 1936, he'd also competed for a prize at the National Eisteddfod for a free metre poem, an innovation in Welsh at that time. The winner was Gwilym R. Jones, an experienced poet, but Aneurin gained the second prize, and a man called W.H. Rees became third. He was originally from Blaenau Ffestiniog, who'd been exiled in Newcastle on Tyne for decades. The poems of Aneurin and W.H. Rees were collated, with both authors contributing an introduction each, and the collection was published by Foyles of London under the title A Thy Lice in 1937. Why foils then? Foils employed one of the most gifted Welshmen of his generation, William Griffiths of Gilbach, who became a great friend of Aneurin. Griffiths was an ex-miner, as were his two brothers, but Will was also a musician of professional standard, and he'd moved to London to work. He was Aneurin's greatest friend. He worked in Foyle's bookshop, where he established a Welsh section, which Aneurin described as his academy. Will Griffiths published a number of books about Wales under the Foyle's imprint, including Y Ddau Lais. He went on to establish Shop Griffiths in Cecil Court, an important centre for the London Welsh, and a generation later for a young learner such as myself. When Griffith died in 1962, Aneurin said in Barn, "It was no small thing for a young lad with no college education and no financial backing to have a man who believed in him as a friend." In 1944, Foyles published another book by Aneurin, his study of the work of James Joyce, a pioneering work about a famous exiled author by a man, Aneurin, who could himself have been considered an exile. One of Aneurin's furthest wishes was to expand his readers' horizons, not only to include James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, but other authors such as Alexander Pushkin, Edgar Allan Poe, Francois Mauriac, and others. It must be recognized that the content of Y Ddau Lais is not important as sublime poetry, and the volume was harshly criticized, but it did discuss contemporary issues which Welsh poets had felt the need to discuss before this. The two poets had included a preface each, and Aneurin used the phrase propaganda, the poet's propaganda, and that, together with the Penaberth troubles, had awoken Robert Williams Parry from his long silence to send a number of his greatest sonnets to be published in Heddiw. The war was now imminent. There was no question of Aneurin serving in the armed forces, apart from his TB in youth. Pharmacists were necessary for public health. But Aneurin didn't have to go to war. The war came to him, as we shall hear shortly. A number of prominent Welshmen were most concerned about the effect of the war on Wales and the Welsh language. Aneurin and Alun Talbot Davies' prophetic response was to establish Llyfrau Driw. The symbol of the Driw, the wren, acknowledged the success of Penguin books, and the Little Welsh books were a sweeping success. By the 50s and 60s, Driw was one of the country's most important publishing houses. But the war dealt Aneurin a severe blow. A bomb fell on his business in the devastating attack on Swansea in February 1941, when the heart of the city, its heart indeed, was destroyed. And the home also suffered a great deal of damage. After the explosion, the family, Aneurin, Mary and their son Owen, went to shelter in the country. And then Aneurin had to move temporarily to London, to the BBC, at the suggestion of his friend Hywel Davies. Aneurin lost all Heddiw's paperwork, including Robert Williams Parry's correspondence, including the telegrams he'd send in order to move a comma from one place to another, and other such minor details. Despite the devastating loss of his business, the Luftwaffe had made Aneurin, and indeed Wales, a great favour when they bombed the shop. The government insurance was totally inadequate, and Aneurin had to look for another career. And within a short time, Hywel Davies had gained him a place in London with the BBC, as I said. He received training in broadcasting in London and experience of reading the news in Welsh. In due course, the name of Talbot Davies became associated with Welsh broadcasting, and that to this day, for 3 generations. Aneurin would produce hundreds of Welsh feature programmes for radio. Some would discuss European writers and philosophers, while others would be warm descriptions of locations in Wales, with an emphasis on the place of chapels and the Welsh community. In 1952, he was appointed the BBC representative in West Wales, and in 1966 as head of programmes for the BBC in Wales, second only to Alan Oldfield Davies. Aneurin was responsible, together with Douglas Clevedon, for Dylan Thomas's radio career and for the radio poems, which included Sŵn y Gwynt sy'n chwythu. Some people were quite willing to criticise Aneurin. He'd sacrificed his nationalism for his job, they said, and he'd abandoned Welsh nonconformism for the old alien church. Much of this was based on jealousy, I'm sure, and a degree of intolerance. It's doubtful that anyone could have battled more fiercely than Aneurin to secure the growth and quality of Welsh radio and television. There's much truth in Derek Llwyd Morgan's comment in the New English DNB. For a quarter of a century, much of Welsh broadcasting was Calvinism aired. The audience could be grateful for that. But before Aneurin retired at the age of 60 in 1969, he demonstrated the same confidence on screen as at the microphone. He produced programmes such as Dylanwadau, modelled on John Freeman's television interviews in London, and the programme with Saunders Lewis particularly was a masterpiece. Nobody who saw it could forget Saunders's words, "I was rejected by everyone." But in a very short space of time, Saunders would deliver the radio lecture, Tynged yr Iaith, which changed the history of Wales. The words, "the language is more important than self-government," was the subject of fierce debate. Aneurin agreed with the statement. He said, as editor of Barn in 1963, Barn agrees with the statement. We who are alive today will never see any sort of self-government. Well, I'm quite pleased that Aneurin was mistaken here, but bearing in mind the period, it was quite a sensible opinion. In 1958, we saw Aneurin's most important contribution to the affairs and life of the church in Wales, although, as far as I can see, this isn't mentioned in any of his books. The Electoral College of the Church in Wales had selected the Bishop of Monmouth, Edwin Morris, an Englishman, as Archbishop of Wales, on the principle that he'd been a bishop for longer than any of the other bishops. Buggins' turn, actually. Within a short time, the college chose another non-Welsh-speaking Welshman as Bishop of Swansea and Brecon. And later on today, Enid will describe some of the battle which ensued. Aneurin's contribution was the lively booklet, Bilingual Bishops and All That. Aneurin didn't put his name to it, although it would be apparent at the time that he was the author. When I looked at it in the National Library, the catalogue didn't know who the author was. The subject was central to Aneurin's mindset. The gap between Welsh speakers and those who didn't have the language had caused him great pain since his days in London. The stormy petrel was now anxious to be a dove of peace, anxious to bring the two sides closer together. By now, the argument about the Archbishop's appointment has been forgotten. Yet, it's significant that the names of Glyn Simon and Geo Williams, two of the appointment's most prominent critics, are still significant for us today. But Edwin Morris's name has been consigned to history. Another achievement after the creation of Llyfrau Driw by Aneurin and his brother Alan was the establishment of the monthly journal Barn in November 1962. This was the most important journal in Welsh since the Old Ford Gron and the Cymru Coch. It continues to this day, thanks to government funding. And for the next 18 years, until his death, but with some gaps, Aneurin would contribute Arl Ymyl y Ddalen with varied comments on the condition of life in Wales, including the occasional autobiographical note. Aneurin was painfully aware that he'd never been to university. He once made a joke about this, saying that he had at last attained the degree of BTA, Bid to America. But he did get an honorary BA from Swansea University. He'd almost never put forward comment on the classical literary traditions of Wales, but he was deeply interested in the rising cohort of Welsh writers writing in English, such as Idris Davies, T. Harry Jones, Glyn Jones, and particularly Dylan Thomas and the artist and poet David Jones. Aneurin's book, Dylan, Druid of the Broken Body, became the subject of fierce argument. People such as Euros Bowen and Martin Lloyd-Jones argued that there was no more significance to Christianity in Dylan's poetry than in his use of biblical terms. And there ensued a fierce debate between Lloyd-Jones and Aneurin in the pages of Barn. Whatever one's opinion of the argument, it should be recognised that Aneurin was much more courteous and less extreme in his use of language. In many ways, as I said, the stormy petrel wished to be a dove of peace, or a bridge between groups where there was no mutual understanding. Aneurin was a worshipper and a lay reader at Eglwys Dewi Sant, the Welsh church in Cardiff, and he'd contribute articles and poems to Yr Hael a Gangell and to the Llan, the church publications. He has a particularly important article in the October 1960 issue under the title Eglwys Newydd, a new church. He was bold enough to criticise Glanmor Williams' book on Bishop Richard Davies. The fault with Welsh historians, said Aneurin, was that they thought that the Church of England was a Protestant church, almost on the same pattern as the Methodist or Baptist churches. But the word Protestant never appears in any edition of the prayer book, in Welsh or in English. And Richard Davies in particular wished to restore the Catholicism of the church. For Aneurin, the Catholic Church was the ancient church of the Welsh people, the Church of Dewi and Deiniol, Dyfrig and Istyd, and of Bishop Morgan, Edmund Priest and Ellis Wynne, the Vicar Pritchard and Griffith Jones, and the nameless clouds of witnesses who departed this life without any memorial. No, the church in Wales is not the church of Henry VIII, but a church established in the dawn of our history as a nation. Aneurin had come to see Protestantism as a purely spiritual religion with no emphasis on the physical and the everyday. That's why the Book of Common Prayer was so important to him when he shifted his allegiance from the Methodist to the Church. He said, "The prayer book is our guide on our pilgrimage through life, from week to week, from feast day to feast day, from year to year. It helps us to live an organized life." It's ironic, of course, that the Book of Common Prayer is by now a dead letter, but Aneurin took part in the process of revising the order of services to suit the new age. Aneirin's life was not without its tragedies. In 1963, his elder son Owen was killed in a horrific accident. He left a wife, Rita, and their son Simon. They both moved to Australia, and there, in his teens, Simon committed suicide. In 1971, his wife, Mary, died. After that, says one of his friends, Aneirin was never the same man. And the last 9 years of his life was a long process of illness and of hospital visits. Despite this, he still wrote for Barn and published 2 books, Diana Cherchwyn, a volume of poems, and a volume of the excellent letters he'd received from David Jones. How should we remember Aneirin Talbot Davies today? Not as a poet or playwright, although he did experiment with both. As the author of travel books about Carmarthenshire and the Vale of Glamorgan, certainly. As a critic and writer, again, certainly. But his greatest feat, surely, was his ability as a radio and television broadcaster, a transient art, most the pity. The same thing is true of his ability to speak, privately or publicly, or as a lay preacher. You can't buy recordings or tapes of his work, unfortunately. I only heard Aneirin speak in public once, when he, on the 22nd of May, 1969, when he delivered a superb address in the church of Llanfair Mathavar Neithaf on the bicentenary of the death of Gronwy Owen. But I would like to mention 2 other aspects to his life. The first is the strength of his Christian life, where his membership of the church was central, but where he remained open to listen and to discuss all opinions of note with anyone. The second is the wide range of his friendships. It would be impossible to name them all, but I would mention the names of those who wrote about him in Barn when he died. Alun O'Neill Davies, Geo Williams, Archbishop of Wales, Brynley Richards, Ifor Rhys, the Archdruid, Ifor Rhys, Rhydian Williams, and Gomer Roberts, 2 ministers, Saunders Lewis, and the poet Alan Llwyd. When Aneirin was very ill toward the end of his life, Alan Llwyd wrote him a poem saying that from his bravery and suffering came the richness of his meditations, and even in sickness he continued to praise the glories of his land and his God. Aneirin Talbot Davies was a true Christian writer and broadcaster. Thank you.
Gerald, diolch o galon i chi.
Thank you, Gerald. That was so interesting. And of course, what's interesting also is that you mentioned that the heritage continues to Rhodri, Geraint and Rhodri. I was in college with Rhodri, although, as he always says, he was a bit younger than me. But he's now General Secretary for the BBC, so the influence of the family still pertains. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask now? I could just ask quick questions. As I say, there will be an opportunity for a further discussion later on in the informal. There is an opportunity if you want to ask anything now. One thing I learned personally was that he lived for some time in Gorseinon. I'm sure it's interesting that he'd had the experience of living in the industrial Gorseinon, but went back to Swansea. Oh, yeah. Yes, of course. And another thing that struck me how fate can have such an effect on one, particularly the fact that the Luftwaffe flattened his shop, but gave a favor by steering him in another direction. I must say the shop was a centre for the Welsh speakers of Swansea. And of course, the other centre was Ralph's shop, which that was also a very important centre. Okay.
Please.
Could I make a comment? It was interesting to hear you talk about Aneurin Talfan, that he had influence when he was ill as a young man. And what's important, striking, is you could say the same thing about John Morris Jones and Griffith John Williams. Both of them were secondary school pupils, and both of them had a year of illness. And S.M. Powell, Professor Griffith John Williams, teacher in Tregaron, when Griffith John Williams appointed Professor of Welsh in Cardiff, wrote to him to congratulate him and saying, well, the most important thing about your period in Tregaron was not my teaching, although S.M. Powell was considered a remarkable teacher, but the year when you were ill, because you came back from your illness to be a bookworm. You'd read so much during that year. It's interesting. You're saying the same thing about Aneurin Talfan. The influence of that period of illness, and on three of them, really. And the same is true of John Morris Jones. Yes. Aneurin was very familiar with the hymnology of Wales. And particularly, of course, Williams Pantycelyn. Aneurin also was proud of his ability to learn poetry. When the Eisteddfod product came out, he'd learn the awdl and the crown poem and could recite reams of poetry. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, could I thank Gerald? Thank you again so much. And I hope there'll be an opportunity at the end to have a further chat about this subject. So welcome back. I hope you've had an opportunity to have a cup of tea or stretch your legs. I look forward now to hearing what Enid has to say. And she is originally from Almanford, but escaped from there or left there to go to St Anne's in Oxford and begin her journalistic career on the Western Mail in 1961. She returned to the academic work and to follow an MA degree, and then married Gerald and brought up 3 boys, and at the same time wrote to the Hael and became editor of the Llan for 7 years. A very serious task, particularly in that period. So in response to the call to she did a degree in theology and then was priest in 1996. The gap between both perhaps reflected the attempt to see women being ordained. She cared for small parishes in Cerrig, Llanfihangel, Creuddyn, and Ysbyty Ystwyth before appointed to the post of Director of the Board of Mission of the Church in Wales in 1993, and returned after that post to parish ministry in Maes Teg. Was that Llanganwyd? Yes, yes. And retired in 2005, but not much of a retirement. And she fills gaps in the Llanbadarn Fawr area. She has also been president of the Christians Together, which is a safe space to discuss, and following that has been editor of Flora. So, welcome, Enid, and it's a great pleasure to hear what you have to say as you maintain the Welsh nature and talk about your memoirs as an editor. So very warm welcome, Enid. Well, thanks. Can you see me? Yes. I can't see a picture of myself, not that that matters. Yes, we can see you, no problem. Well, this contribution isn't the fruit of academic research, but rather the personal experience, reminiscences about the experience of becoming a churchwoman toward the end of the last century and being welcomed into the Welsh-speaking Welsh community of the Diocese of Bangor, and merely acceding to Wyn James's request. I had a typical Welsh nonconformist upbringing. It took 10 years for me to take the step, considering treachery at the time, of becoming a churchwoman. But I discovered in Llangefni something I didn't think existed, namely a Welsh-speaking, liturgical, down-to-earth church. From a seed planted in Exford, the conviction blossomed, and I was confirmed in the Advent season of 1968 by Bishop Gio Williams. I had to wear a necessary scarf to cover my head, called a veil, believe it or not. I was 28 years of age and very ignorant, and with no idea how ignorant I was. My ecclesiastical education began straight away. The parish priest in Llangefni was Tom Bailey Hughes, a man of honourable ecclesiastical heritage. He was a scathing cartoonist and acted as chaplain to the British Society of Cartoonists. He had an extraordinary sense of humour. 2 of his cartoons were published in each issue of Yr Haul. They were collected into 2 little pamphlets, which still raise a smile today. They're easily memorable, and such as the one where 2 priests are sympathizing with each other about the state of the church, and one says, yes, things are bad, but thanks be to God, they're even worse in Salem. In a slightly less satirical one, a church mouse asked the vicar, is harvest Thanksgiving this year? And while we're on the subject of a sense of humour, Orwig Evans, editor of Llan, and his wife Havina cared for St Gredival's Church in the parish of Penmynydd, between Llangefni and Menai Bridge. And a sign of their humour was that they had a cat called Ollie. Why? Well, because she was cat Ollie. Penmynydd was a very small parish, and Orwig had probably been established there so that he could devote his time to editing Welsh publications. An impossibility today. He'd begun the task of editing a Gangell back in 1944, and that was amalgamated with Yr Haul in 1953, and he took on the Llan in 1958 and carried on until about 1970. His burden was lightened 3 years later in 1958 when Norman Hughes became editor of Yr Haul, and Orwig continued to edit the Llan, and as I said, until 1970. Tom Bailey soon introduced me to Norman Hughes, vicar of the adjoining parish of Pentraeth and editor of Yr Haul. I didn't need much persuading to promise to help him with the literary section of the magazine. I only did this work for about 3 years, from 1969 to the spring of 1972, contributing articles and reviews before moving from a quarterly responsibility to a much heavier weekly one when I was appointed editor of Llan. But Gerald and I continued to contribute to the literary section for many years. Working with Norman Hughes from 1969 until his sadly early death at only 55 in 1980 proved to be a theological initiation, in addition to bringing great help to me in beginning to get to know who was who among the Welsh speakers. He introduced me to J.W. James, the church historian, and to Tommy Morris, former warden of the church hostel. And when I look back, the variety of contributors which I had was amazing. Norman Hughes began editing at Hael in 1958, a period of a major disagreement concerning the need for bilingual bishops. When Edwin Morris was appointed in 1958, an Englishman of decided views appointed Archbishop. Soon afterwards, a non-Welsh-speaking Welshman, Jack Thomas, was appointed Bishop of Swansea and Brecon, although 3 Welsh speakers had been named during the Electoral College deliberations. Bishop Glyn Simon, in a letter to the people of the Diocese of Llandaf, suggested that the Electoral College should have considered the need for someone who could speak the language. Well, that a can of worms that opened. The Western Maid was deluged with letters, some praising the appointment and others not, and others more anxious to defend the Electoral College than the Welsh language. It was during this period that Gwenedd left the church, calling her a traitress. In 1958, an English pamphlet, and Gerald has mentioned it, Bilingual Bishops and All That, was published under the nom de plume Llia Memphis. It was an excellent pamphlet which argued how important it was for people to be able to worship in their mother tongue, and their worship was really worse in another language. It quoted St. Augustine, T.S. Eliot, and Simon Weil. Edwin Morris insisted that the tone of the pamphlet was deplorable. Only an Eirin Talbot Davies could have written it. The real bone of contention was the importance of the Welsh language rather than the standards of the Electoral College. Everything was supposed to be confidential, but the Electoral College has always been a leaky basket, despite the arguments put up by defenders that is guided by the Holy Spirit. And that was the subject of one of Norman Hughes's first editorials. He proceeded scathingly to discuss one of his favourite subjects, namely the nature of the guidance of the Holy Spirit. The matter was personally important to him because his viewpoints were so often at odds with the views of the majority. Did disagreement with the results of an election mean that those who opposed it were going against the Holy Spirit? A very serious accusation. Norman's way in any argument was to go to the theological roots. That's how he wrote in his editorial notes, and when addressing the governing body, where his piercing wit was welcomed. He'd sort of half close his eyes and cut like a razor through the commonplace rhetoric of the other members. Proof of his consistency was his vote against the Covenant for Unity, which was the subject of much discussion in the early 70s. He continued to edit at Hael for 21 years until 1979, when it was replaced by the interdenominational magazine Christian, which I edited. The decision caused him a great deal of pain, since he rightly thought that Christian couldn't express a Welsh church voice, as did at Hael under his guidance. I've spent some time talking about Norman Hughes, not only because he was, for me, a teacher and a personal friend, but because he didn't at the time, nor subsequently, get the attention or the respect that he deserved. He could write Welsh in a robust and striking style, and his viewpoints were also robust and striking. He left school in Holyhead at the age of 14 and served as a soldier in Burma during the Second World War. He was hit in the forehead by a spent bullet, and he was fortunate that a young surgeon was on the spot who dared perform an operation in the jungle to remove the bullet. But he was left with a gap in the bone of his forehead, and he was of the opinion that every day after that was a gift to be treasured. He used the money which he received as compensation for the wound to buy fast cars, and he drove them pretty fast as well. After the war, he was prepared for entry to university at the college in Ystad Meurig during the bitter winter of 1947. He must have shown exceptional intellectual promise because he was sent to St. Stephen's House in Oxford. He was entranced by the rich beauty of the liturgy there. And Norman, therefore, was not only a high churchman, but also a conservative and a nationalist. Quite a rare combination. He'd lend me books and recommend others for me to buy. It was he who introduced me to the work of St. Augustine, Thomas Merton. When I realized that there was a constant inner voice urging me to put myself forward to be ordained, I asked for his advice, and he was generous and wise and expressed no opposition, although his high church background would have opposed that. By editing a Llan, I came to learn who those Welsh speakers were, who enthusiastic and confident enough to write for a Welsh paper. I realized later that my attempt to enliven its contents didn't lead to an increase in circulation, not at all. Those who bought it were supporters, and the supporters would buy it whatever the contents. And the circulation remained more or less the same. Monday was the day for the Llan. The material collected during the previous week had to be put in order, and about 1,000 words written for the editorial, and the rest arranged tidily before sending the whole to the Cambrian News. The Reverend T.S. Davies, Vicar of Llanfeilion, would cast an eye over the proofs, and to my eternal shame, I never met him or thanked him for his quiet fidelity. Regular pages would appear under the headings of Amser I Feddwl and Pynciau Dydd, and Ymag Acw would contain catchy quotations from other papers. These pages needed regular contributors, and they were Norman Hughes, Hugh Pierce-Jones, Dewi Thomas, and Bertie Lewis. They'd be responsible for writing a month at a time. In contrast to Norman's conservatism, the Vicar of Pwllheli, Hugh Pierce-Jones, was an enthusiastic Labour man. His delight was the world of drama. He'd won prizes for his plays at the National Eisteddfod, and he trained local drama groups for the Urdd Eisteddfod. I was also of the opinion that we needed a viewpoint which was different from the high churchmanship of the Bangor Diocese, and Bertie Lewis, the evangelist, would contribute regularly from Aberystwyth, and the pacifist Dewi Thomas would also voice his opinion. I'd peruse religious papers in Welsh and English, and would pick interesting quotes and translate them. I'd also gather quotations from the Welsh classics, particularly Morgan Llwyd. I found out years later how much these quotations were appreciated by a priest from the Diocese of Monmouth, who'd learned Welsh and would buy the Llan regularly. James Coots was Vicar of Monmouth and chaplain to the Timawr convent near Monmouth. Collecting news items from the various dioceses wasn't easy, but ecclesiastical appointments would come from the diocesan offices. And I was proud to see that the letters to the editor page was often full. A regular contributor to that page was Harold Rees of Llandarog near Carmarthen in the Diocese of St David's. Dropping the bulky envelope through the postbox on the Monday afternoon was the high point of the week, because at that time there was a hope that this would be an issue without any errors, misprints, and I wouldn't have put my foot in. When I just started the work, I remember Lias Hughes, Vicar of Dolgella, very kindly sent me a page showing how to refer to the high-ups in the church, such as bishops, the archbishop, archdeacons, and deans. And that was another lesson. Leaving my text for a moment, Lias hadn't much to say for covenanting, but he did receive an invitation to preach at Capel Mawr Dolgella. He took his from the first book of Kings, chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to him saying, "What do you do here, Lias?" The list of more occasional contributions reads like a roll call of writers, polemicists and church people who make substantial contributions to public life in Wales, Aneurin Talbot Davies, Jackal Williams and his brother, the Vicar of Carnarvon, Glyndwr Williams, Gwynfryn Richards, Dean of Bangor, and brother of Brynley Richards, the poet and lawyer from Maes Teg, would also write. And the Sun wasn't merely the paper of the Diocese of Bangor. John Gravel, Leslie Evans, George Noakes, Tom Bowen, T.I. Ellis, David Jenkins and Terry Thomas, all from the south, would contribute. And all of them were worth reading. Most prominent among the women was the tireless Mary Ellis and Hefina, widow of Orwig Evans. There'd be occasional contribution from Helen Ramage, the historian, and myself, of course, I was the editor. Hefina represented those generations of women who were, to all intents and purposes, their husbands' unpaid but enthusiastic curates. Being close to Bangor is a tremendous help in familiarising with and becoming part of the society which is firmly embedded in Welsh church culture. I doubt whether such a phenomenon exists today. During this period, and to my surprise, I was co-opted onto the governing body as a young member, and the church's Welsh liturgical subcommittee, whose secretary was Euros Bowen of Llangolwyn. The church at that time was revising its prayer book. On one occasion, Euros wanted to change a clause in the creed, referring to Christ as having addysgynodd o'r nefoedd, because it was too literal. Fair enough point. And he very gently called me devilishly conservative for suggesting that a little Welsh subcommittee of the Church in Wales couldn't change a clause in the creed which has stood for centuries and which tied us to the Anglican, Catholic and Orthodox world. I was still learning. The governing body at that time still met in Llandrindod. In the 60s, representatives of the different dioceses would gather together in different hotels. The Bangor Diocese Hotel was the Waverley, which was quite an eye-opener for me. The group would still be talking far into the night, and a pile of sandwiches would be ordered at about 9:30, and nearly all the men would have a pint of beer, and everyone would be enthusiastically theologizing about the subject of the day's official discussions. This was in earnest, with a great deal of fun and laughter. We knew that the Diocese of Llandafod and other hostel would be imbibing gin rather than beer. It later dawned on me that the majority of these Welsh clerics belonged to the high church tradition, the Tractarian, and they were enthusiasts for the Welsh language. I remember one comic incident in Llandrindod. Norman and I had taken a break and gone for a walk round the lake there, and met two Orthodox priests. They were Father Barnabas and his deacon at the time, Father Deiniol, now of Blaenau Ffestiniog. Norman knew Barnabas well and introduced me to him as editor of a llan. I'd used parts of his circular in the llan. Barnabas stared at me in amazement before, and I said, but you're young. Those meetings at the Waverley assisted me greatly to develop what I would call a church memory. This was how I learned about the losses to the church. One who'd been bishop to the Bangor group in the Waverley was J.C. Jones, a Welshman originally from Llanelli, who worked himself to death in the diocese, as did Timothy Rees in Llandaf. When J.C. Jones was established as Bishop at Bangor, the service, apart from the legal declarations, was all in Welsh, which was revolutionary at the time, and which wouldn't happen today in any diocese because the language itself has become weaker. It was interesting that the Bangor nonconformist had claimed him as one of us. The general opinion was that if you asked Bangor people what a saint was, they'd name J.C. Jones. The appointment of Timothy Rees as Bishop of Llandaf in 1931 was a clear sign of regeneration and a new direction in the church in Wales. Timothy Rees set a new pattern of what a bishop should be. He was from Ceredigion, and this thoroughly bilingual monk came to Llandaf from the community of the Resurrection in Mirfield, in northern England. Mirfield was renowned for inculcating high church principles in prospective priests, and he was a fluent orator and preacher in Welsh and in English. He was Bishop of Llandaf when the Depression in South Wales was at its worst. His loss was a severe blow when he died from overwork in 1939. It could be said that his high churchmanship started alienated the nonconformists. After the Second World War, there came a realization that new thinking was needed as to how the new structures could best serve the nation. In 1947, the Commission, again at Llyweddi, the Nation and the Prayer Book, was set up to crystallize this vision and to recommend practical ways of promoting it, including the place and contribution of the Welsh language. The chairman of the Welsh group was Jesse Jones, and amongst the members were Orwig Evans, and the lay members were T.I. Ellis, Secretary of Undeb Cymru Fydd, and the woman who would become his wife, Mary Headley. Our translator's parents, by the way. They all realised the need for renewal in the parishes, and this included the situation of the Welsh language. A conference was held in 1953 to consider the next steps, and G.O. William gave an excellent address, which was used later by his opponents when electing a bishop for St David's as evidence that he was a dangerous nationalist. But the promises were not realised. T.I. Ellis published a book, A Mayor Vesgyn, in 1958, where he expressed his disappointment and anger that the recommendations of the 1953 Commission weren't implemented. Idris Bell of the same Commission had described the Church's attitude to the Welsh language as stepmotherly. Somehow, when an ecclesiastical problem arises, the group of people given the responsibility of solving it bring forward quite a sensible set of recommendations. Because there are so many problems and not enough money, it can give rise to disappointment and anger. And I was about to learn a few more lessons. The family was about to move back to Ceredigion, to the diocese in St David's. I hadn't realised the diocesan boundary was like a very high hedge. Indeed, a predecessor of mine at the Board of Mission many years later insisted that there weren't 6 dioceses, but 6 tribes defending their rights. The great difficulty was that I was moving over the border to the northern corner of St David's diocese, and that I never got to know the Welsh community of that diocese in the same way that I knew the people of Bangor. I already knew Bertie Lewis and Dewi Thomas as willing contributors to a llan. After moving to Aberystwyth, I remember being questioned in detail by Bertie to see whether my experience corresponded closely enough to the evangelical experience of being saved, and whether I was a sufficiently orthodox Christian. I'd crossed a boundary, not only a diocesan boundary, but an ecclesiastical. There was a high church tradition in St David's as well. But by the 70s, this was chiefly in South Pembrokeshire. It was English and firmly against the ordination of women. But it was there that it was accepted that I had been sufficiently trained by the Vicar of Carnarvon, Glyndwr Williams, to begin serving as a lay reader. By 1974, Cymdeithas yr Iaith was very active, and a trio of Welsh priests in Carmarthenshire established the Welsh Society of the Church in Wales. Tom Bowen Llanegwr was a leading light. I remember joining with them to organise a Welsh-only communion service with Bishop Eric Roberts, another one who was against the ordination of women, as celebrant. I remember him asking what is the aim of the meeting, and I sought to explain to him that having a communion service in Welsh only had become a rarity. To conclude, therefore, when the church was established in 1922, it was agreed that the constitution would be in Welsh as well as English.
Williams, pan yn arches.
It was Geo Williams, Archbishop, who ensured the translation of the Constitution to Welsh. He ensured that the Constitution would be translated. David Jenkins was to ensure legal accuracy, and it was a considerable document. But Enid Pierce Roberts was there to keep an eagle eye to make sure that the language flowed naturally. They, in one argument, I heard they'd come by saying quite shortly, if it's not clear, it can't be legal. It was making sure that the longest legal document since the date of Hywel Dda existed in a rich and fluent form. Isn't it ironic that that language was available for the new Senedd in Cardiff? It's strange to think that the institution regarding as the old alien woman had made such a valuable contribution to the secular world. Thank you. Thank you, Enid.
Fel chi'n dweud, mae'n ddiddorol dweud
as you say. It's interesting how we've heard about David Jenkins's word as well.
Mae'r hyn ystrones yn aml yn gyrru ni'n benwa.
The old alien woman is often drives one crazy, but then again there are virtues.
Gai wahodd cwestiynau i...
May I invite any questions for Enid, please? Thank you very much. I enjoyed the lecture tremendously. Do you feel that the situation of the language in the church in Wales is a bit better than it was? Officially, yes. There are more. The diocese make an attempt to produce bilingual material on the web, and the website is a good one and appears enthusiastic for the language. That varies from one diocese to another, of course. But I doubt whether the language is as strong in the parishes. That is, the condition of the church has deteriorated, like that cartoon that I referred to. And the chapels have deteriorated terribly. And we're still going the same direction. And that is a European feature. We're not different from other nations in this. In the fact that so much of the population had turned their back on Christianity generally. So it's the weakness of the church and the language, they run in parallel. It might be worth emphasising that there are Dyfrig here in the vicar of Dewi Sant. And you're looking back on periods on Erin Talbot, like a light in shining in Cardiff. We're beginning to see in Cardiff now. We are having services in Welsh only. There are services in St Catherine's in the east, and they're holding services in Welsh from time to time. So the picture isn't completely black. But you must bear in mind that I have retired. I've been retired for nearly 20 years. It's interesting. Your point, Enid. What tends to happen, and this has happened in the past, was that young people went to university and tend to leave Wales. Very often now, they come back and stay in Wales, and it's good that we can make provision for them, particularly in areas such as Canton, where a number of Welsh speakers is around 30%. So that's hardly. It is indeed. Sorry. I was just saying, where young people used to go to London, and Ellen Salmon is amongst those, they tend to come to Cardiff. Yes, they do. Thank you. Any further questions? Manon has turned on her camera. I don't know whether you want to ask anything, Manon? No? Just Ainsley? You have a question, Ainsley? Thank you. I won't tend to speak too much, but it's such rich sessions, and I don't know where to begin, really, or where to refer my question. I have a question. What was the appeal of the church in Wales? Perhaps to you personally, Enid, but thinking of Gerald and talking about Aneurin Talfan, going the case of Aneurin Talfan from Calvinistic Methodism in rural Wales to St Margaret Street and St Benet's, they seemed world apart.
Yeah.
It must have appeared very exotic. The sacraments and the incense and so on, very high church.
Mae cwestiwn y ieithyddol wedi bod yn bwysig ar gyfer y ddwy sesiwn yma'n amlwg.
I don't know what that was.
Ond hefyd o ran einl Catholic.
Perhaps Zoom is very Protestant and takes exception. The question I have, a linguistic question has been important for both sessions and the whole series indeed, but also as regards Anglo-Catholicism, there is a language beyond words, isn't there? The rituals and the sacraments. It opens out onto an exotic world, but also one which fascinates and draws one in. And that's more of a comment than a question. Yes, it's interesting because I think it was the discovering the collect, and I remember trying to explain to my mother and quoting the 21, since we cannot without you commit your Holy Spirit in everything to steer our hearts. And I believe that my mother understood, and my father was a regular communicant in Llangefni when they came up. And it's interesting, Aled Jones-Williams is in the group somewhere, and he was speaking yesterday about the difficulty of using words about God at all. There is room for silence and to getting to know the liturgy. It's like wearing new shoes in a way. You have to break them in. You have to use them before you're comfortable with them. And it takes some time to familiarize before you realize the wealth there. And there's always something new coming out of the liturgy every day. Exactly. Yes. You talk about the importance of silence and the importance of theology, that you can't limit or confine God within words. So it's an interesting question. Aled's point in introducing his new book was saying we only have words. They're the only things we have, but they have to be careful. Thank you. I can quote a history from Aneurin's background. His brother, Gronwy, had gone to theological college in Aberystwyth, I think. And he had a slightly difficult time mentally. He felt low, depressed, and he wrote to his brother Aneurin, who was busy in London, asking for advice to raise his spirits. And Aneurin said in a postcard, try a pint of Guinness. And unfortunately, a fellow student saw the card, and the result was that Gronwy was dragged in front of the disciplinary committee and was suspended as a student. And what Goronwy did was turn to the church and became a parish priest. Minor sins can be a great stumbling block.
Sy'n mor ffantastig am y sesiwn yma yw bod nhw'n dod â'r cymeriadau yma sy'n ymddangos yn ddau-ddimensiwn.
And Aneurin's father had a tremendous shock and a disappointment when the church authorities' behaviour. What's fantastic about this session is to bring these characters who appear perhaps two-dimensional. They bring them alive. Thank you, Gerald, for that. Are there any other questions? I was... Yes, we are. There's a bit of an echo somewhere. We were about 5 years ago working on a volume of Enid Pierce Roberts' book on the history of Powys, and Dr. Hugh Walkers and myself read years' worth of Church and Wales publications. I must say, although the work was, it was extremely interesting, and I can't believe, in fact, that any other denomination has a better paper than the Llan in its period. And it was, one was attracted very often. There are so many interesting articles and thought-provoking. The church, indeed, can be very proud of the standard of the Llan, particularly in that period. Thank you very much. A very valid point. Any further questions? Because if not, perhaps we'll bring the formal session to an end and end the recording and translation. But before that, on behalf of all of you, can I thank Gerald and Erin from the bottom of my heart for being so interesting. Two very interesting talks and their for their contributions. Thank you both. This is not a question, but just to approve and just to thank. Yes, I was merely applauding. So thank you, Enid and Gerald, for their contributions. As Denzil said, two very excellent discussions, and not just from Denzil, but from all of us who've been here. We look forward to reading your next volume.